Hello and welcome everybody to our continuing Visiting Artists Lecture Series, sponsored by the Undergraduate Art Department, the Graduate Art Department, and the Center for New Art. And today, excuse me, what? I'm going to crack you. I said I was going to crack him. Today, we're really lucky to welcome here Bonnie Collura. Bonnie is an artist that I've known for a long time. In fact, the first time I saw her work was at the Aldrich Museum of Contemporary Art in a show there. I think it was like a best of season kind of show, something like that. And I came up the stairs at the time, and there was this amazing piece in the middle of the room, and I had no idea who had done it, what it was. And that was my first introduction, and I was totally taken by it. I found it incredible, right? Really sophisticated, kind of some kind of form, anti-form kind of thing going on. Bonnie is the expert of her own work, and she'll tell you more about it. But that sort of began an acquaintance, and we've known each other over the years and followed each other. I've probably followed her. She probably hasn't followed me. But nonetheless, Bonnie received her BFA from Virginia Commonwealth University in 1994 and her MFA from Yale University in 1996. Her sculptures, drawings, and installations have been exhibited in major galleries and museums in the United States, France, Italy, Belgium, Germany, and India, and are included in several national and international collections. Ms. Collura is the recipient of a 1997 Emerging Artists Award from the Aldrich Museum of Contemporary Art. That was probably the one that I saw. And is a 2005 John F. Simon Guggenheim Fellow, which is really quite a sought-after grant, and a 2010 Mac Dowell Colony Fellow, and a United States Artist Fellowship, and a Rolex Protégé nominee. Her work has been reviewed in the New York Times, Art Forum, Art in America, Art News, Sculpture Magazine, Bomb Magazine, Beautiful Decay, Time Out New York, and several other print and online publications. Currently, Ms. Collura is working on a sculptural and video installation entitled White Light with the assistance of a Penn State College of Arts and Architecture faculty research grant, as well as a textile and sculpture-based project. Please join me in welcoming Bonnie Collura. You have the microphone. Okay. Thanks.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for the kind introduction. And just so you know, I am a follower of Michael's work, and I've been a big fan of his work and practice for many years. So thanks for taking your time to sort of listen to me talk about my work. I'm going to, I guess, go over some early things that led into some more substantial projects and end with some current things that are happening in the studio. The first image I'm showing on your right, well, first, I come from the land of central Pennsylvania. And I lived in New York after I left grad school. I moved to Brooklyn, and I lived there on and off for about 10 years. And I taught at all kinds of schools and was really kind of living for the proximity of Penn Station. And the coming back and forth to my studio, there was always sort of a regrouping time, and I felt that having more continuity in my studio practice would be really beneficial. So 7 years ago, I took a job at Penn State University, where I'm teaching now. And Matt Olson is my partner, and Jerry Beerley was the shop supervisor at the School of Visual Arts. He is a pilot, and he has a small plane, and so last week he flew us over the surrounding area of central Pennsylvania. So on the left, that's where I'm from. And on the right is a photo of me wearing the parts from Destruction Set, and that was from 1996. And that was my Destruction Set was the name of my thesis show at Yale. And I look at this photo now, and not only do I just think about how many years have gone by, but also that there's some things that relate to the project that Michael mentioned called White Light, in terms of forms that have been built to operate off my body. So hopefully, maybe if everything goes right, the lecture will come full circle towards the end. This is not my work. These are two pieces by Mike Kelley. On your right is a piece called More Love Hours Than Can Be Repaid, and on the left is a piece called Eviscerated Corpse. I saw Eviscerated Corpse in person when I was an undergraduate student at VCU. We took a bus trip to VCU from Richmond, Virginia, and it was super exciting. Because, you know, we were going to a museum and we were seeing art and everything was organized for us, so it seemed, you know, extra special. And when I saw Mike Kelley's work, I remember leaving the show, Mike Kelley's show, and they must have had some kind of takeaway publication, because I remember very vividly looking at a show card that said Mike Kelley, and I was so struck by the work I had seen that I just remember the coloration of the card, his name, and the texture of the asphalt, because I was just walking, staring at this show, at this name of this artist, and it also said Metro Pictures, which was the gallery that Mike Kelley showed at the time. Why it made such a big impression on me was that until this point, I was working in all kinds of different medium in the sculpture area at VCU, great facilities, fantastic faculty. But my understanding of sculpture was something that was made out of marble or made out of bronze, or something that had permanence, something that had gone through multiple stages of transformation. And when I saw Mike Kelley's work, this was material that I had access to. And I mean that in two ways. One, that it was relatable. I knew what these things were. These are all found stuffed animals or Afghans from thrift stores. And there was a different, I don't think I understood it in this way at the time, but there was a different level of currency with these types of objects. And that I saw work that was in a museum made from things that I could easily get to. And while I wasn't interested in making Mike Kelley's pieces per se, it gave me a sense of empowerment to think that the things that were all around me could be viable art-making materials. More Love Hours Than Can Be Repaid, Mike Kelley was speaking a little bit about gift economy, and also speaking about his relationship to art in Los Angeles, comparable to the New York art world at the time, and how there was certain kinds of work being shown and sold, and the economy of that, where on the LA side, he was looking at sort of a different kind of value of making art that might not have as much relationship to a commercial value as a sculpture. He was also looking at sort of how, you know, the burden of a gift, and sort of like these are all hand knit things. They are all kind of dolls or Afghans. The Afghans are small usually, so it kind of implies that they were given to a kid, but he found them all in the thrift store. So all of that is like material. It's like it brings a lot of layers to the piece. And what I really loved about Mike Kelley was that research was an important thing for him, and research created a structure in which then he used to make creative decisions, whether they were in his videos or in his sculptures. So I really liked the idea that I could drop into an accessible world all around me, and I could see it as research, that this was viable stuff that I could use to put into an idea. That was really inspiring to me as a young artist. Very different artist. This is Gian Lorenzo Bernini. This is one of his latter sculptures. This is the death of Saint Ludovica. And there's all kinds of interesting things that are the background story of Bernini's life and lifestyle and political standing with the Vatican and Church that I could talk to you about later and you know, after the lecture. But I really loved Bernini's work because I was seeing it all through a book. I've never been to Italy, and I really started looking at it a lot when I was in graduate school. And I was looking at it in terms of the incredible exaggeration. Bernini's known to have invented the bel composto, and it means beautiful whole. It's the merger of sculpture, architecture, and painting, designed to work together He was also really good at moving a viewer's body theatrically through space. So when you look, you might be familiar with the sculpture he did, the Blessed, or Saint Teresa with the golden arrows that come down. Well, when you're looking at that sculpture, you're very aware of the physicality of your neck when you're looking at it. It's very different than when you're looking at a sculpture on the floor. So moving a body around a space was something he was really skilled at. But also all the drama. And how he was very unlike Michelangelo, who felt like the purity was inside the stone. That essentially the sculpture that I'm going to make is in there. And that those are the confines of that carving relationship. Bernini was very much more of a collagist. If he felt like he needed to sort of extend dimension for what, he would just, put rods into the marble, add more, add more. The bottom piece, this is this writhing rug. So the deathbed of Saint Ludovica, basically Ludovica is at the moment before she's leaving her physical body and entering her spiritual realm. So there's this weird orgiastic, like she's like, having a moment there. Everything's writhing and squirming, and the rug is too. The rug, if you can see it, the rug is not carved solid marble. The rug is like, on the ends of this table, probably, there are strips of veneer. It's thin strips of wood that you can tack on the ends of a lesser grade wood, like a plywood, to make it look like a higher grade, right? You can get maple veneer, you can get cherry veneer, all kinds of stuff like that. Basically, it's like tape, right? It's a faux finishing. It's kind of a duping effect. Well, these are very thin strips of red marble that are tacked over a plaster core. And when I learned about that, I thought that was pretty cool, because there was no real interest in, say, being like true to a material. It was all about the effect. And at the time, I was really thinking about Walt Disney and how like there was all kinds of like ways to sort of manipulate and exaggerate the viewer through a space to get them to have an experience on a ride, to then funnel them into a gift shop to get their souvenir. So I was really looking at Bernini as a master of movement. Those things, as well as Louise Bourgeois, I think those three artists are always the haunts in my studio. This is a piece I made very early on called The Virgin and Child. It's made out of foam, so polystyrene foam that you can put in between your 2x4s in the wall, and paper and glue to sort of adhere all the disparities, and water putty. Super simple process. It's kind of like everyone would come in my studio in grad school and think I was like working with like cookie dough, because it was like just this gloppy stuff that you smear on, and then I would methodically sand it to make it look like it was stone or make it look like it was plastic. But it was just simple stuff that I could get easily. That was really important. What was also really important was having liquidity of line, being able to cut and move my overall sculpture's composition easily, fluidly, to sort of make forms look like they were going in and out of each other. So I was into, and this will come up later, into the psychological drawing. It's an illusion. It's an illusionistic drawing. You might know the name of it. It's called it's called Young Maiden, Old Crone. Does anyone know that drawing? Right, so it's kind of a black and white illustration, and if you look at it one way, you can kind of see sort of this young woman with a long, elegant neck, and she has a necklace. If you look at another way, you see the profile of an older woman. And so I really like that idea that it's essentially the same lines, the same data. It just depends on how you perceive it and which one it locks into. I always see the old crone. And I don't know if that's just like I'm paranoid, why is that? So I wanted to see if that could happen with a sculpture, like in 360 degrees. So the Mickey Mouse ears double as these thighs. The eyes, these are the cheeks for the face, that the cheeks go with these eyes, but these are also the swollen eyelids of the Mickey Mouse head that's underneath it. So this was like just the beginning of me trying to sort of fuse references, but not really fusing form yet. It was like trying to melt two different things simultaneously. This is a much larger investigation of stuff that's kind of like that. This is called chain reaction. This is a permanent sculpture in Nordhorn, Germany. This, you can see on the right-hand image, there's a windmill present. And I went there, this is on, they basically invited a bunch of artists to make artworks that kind of were along a bike path to increase tourism in that part of Germany. And so they brought me all along the whole entire path. And when I saw the windmill, I really liked it because in folklore, a windmill is a symbol for an imagined wrong or evil. And I thought that was just like so ridiculous. Like, I was like, I have to be near this imagined evil. As someone who was interested in sort of the tropes of fairy tales, and also interested in dissecting binary couplings, which a huge one is good and evil. And so I started researching that particular windmill, and there's two stones that move counterclockwise to pulverize grain that then get put back into the ground. So it was sort of like this, it felt like this undulating action that occurred with the material inside the windmill, as well as this turning action of the stones that caused the undulating pattern. So I had worked with this large system in my studio practice, and I decided to sort of imagine if I could throw those characters inside the windmill. What would it look like if they turned? If you look on this image, this is an upside down Mickey Mouse head. This is overall, this sculpture is called Chain Reaction, but it breaks down into three separate sculptures that fit together, which is Life, Liberty, the Pursuit of Happiness. I did that purposely. I was an artist chosen to represent America in this, which was incredibly stressful, a little ridiculous, but mostly stressful. And up until this point, I was just making sculptures for an exhibition. So things that were kind of kinks in the work or hangnails in the work, I'd have to kind of work that out for the duration of the show, like 6 weeks, you know? Like I could go into the show and be like, I could have done that better, or I don't know about that. You know, I always feel like that when I go into an exhibition that of something I've made, there's things that I wish I could still do. This was permanent, and I was a little freaked out about that. So, so I thought I would kind of coyly kind of mock that label, and that's why it's named Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And the back side of this object is a Mickey Mouse head, very generalized, with two eyeballs, two eye sockets that fit my backside. So my butt fits into those. And a photograph was taken, but the photo no longer exists, of me learning very poorly how to lasso, like with a rope. And I essentially was trying to lasso in this imagined wrong or evil. I hold hands with the first sculpture up there, and there's a sculpted hand that links her hand with the next sculpture, and then essentially it's supposed to imply that it's going down into the ground and starting a chain reaction. I had my skin tone matched with a prosthetic limb company, and that's the color of the paint that I chose. It's fun to see images of chain reaction now, because anytime I see them pop up on websites or anybody's, Instagram or other weird things, it always has a bunch of cows around it and some like poop on it. So, I mean, you never know. It's cast out of fiberglass, and that was kind of a big deal. This guy was foam, paper and glue, and water putty. Super accessible. When I made this piece, it was important that it was weather stable. The disintegration of material isn't a conceptual part of my work. So having a sculpture break down wouldn't aid to its content, at least not at this point. So it would really, to me, be kind of a flaw in the build of or the design of the object. But I had no idea how to make this thing, like a form like this, permanent. So the prototype for this, a to-scale one, was made exactly like this. Foam, paper and glue, like I'm carving solid foam, I'm taking strips of foam, and I'm turning it the way I used to turn steel and when I when I was welding a lot in undergrad, which I teach welding now. I still love to weld. Mashed with like cast, simple cast, it's all this stuff, disparities, mashing together, and then I'm creating a skin of paper and glue and then covering it with, at this time I covered it with Aqua Resin. But it's still, like you could kick it, someone could kick it in and create a hole with it. So then this had to get molded. And I got a large commission for it so I could hire an outside fabricator to mold that. Once I did though, there was this whole big question of, are you going to mold it? Is it going to be weather stable? Which added a layer which I hadn't really thought about and really wasn't kind of given a lot of information when I was in school to kind of prepare myself for. Was sort of, is your work, is it right? Or what are the conditions to have your work go from one material process into a whole other material process in order for it to go in different venues? And what does that mean? Does that mean you hire people who have skills that you don't? So this was another one that was sort of posed that question. This is Snowman. This is in a sculpture park in Cologne, Germany. It's also in the permanent collection at the Walker Museum. And this was made in the same old school way. The original one was foam, paper and glue was done. I kept trying to advance my skim coating material. So, instead of sort of a very basic water putty, I had graduated up to a 4-ton material, which allows it to get very smooth. But then a fabricator molded this and cast it in fiberglass so it will stand swells of extreme heat and extreme cold. And I really love Snowman. This is the Snowman, the original one in the Walker. The works on the wall are by an artist named Santiago Cuchulo, and they're all made of contact paper. This is a piece called Totem, and in the back you could see Chain Reaction, and this little thing right there is called White. So when I made Snowman and I made Chain Reaction, I think I was at the time 29 years old. I'm 44 now, which is interesting and depressing simultaneously.
We'll wait till you get further. It's really depressing.
Great. I can't wait. I loved Snowman. I like when we installed it in Germany, it was a really great moment for me to see this thing live. What I didn't like was that if I had wanted to make a cut in Snowman, like the way I was easily doing with Virgin and Child, the pink one, it would basically be like a $40,000 cut, because you're cutting through a new material, you're cutting through the labor for the molders, you're cutting through all that fabrication cost. And that was getting paralyzing. It was like I was making my work, it was very fluid. My work is really dependent on me mashing multiple signifiers along with mashing different kinds of material. So sometimes, and it's also important for me in my studio that I get the bump back effect. The bump back is when I'm actually walking back around a sculpture and I don't realize, I forget the spatial parameters around me because I'm so involved with what the sculpture's doing that I bump back into something, right? So you don't, I don't get the bump back like first try. Like I've got to be like moving and twisting and moving this thing a lot. So that was really prohibitive. I also felt like I wasn't at the point yet where I was ready to just sort of farm out an idea and have a fabricator build it. It was creating a lot of tension for me as a maker, but also with relationships with galleries. And so I felt like in order for me to move forward with the work, I needed to learn the skill of molding and casting. So it was not a fun thing to learn, but it has given me tremendous flexibility with the work now. And with the generosity of 3 really kind people, Tony Matelli, Keith Edmere, and John Connor, all very, very skilled mold makers, but all very different kind of mold makers, they all tried their best to teach me the beginning parts of how to make flexible rubber molds. This is my studio, one part of my studio in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania now, where that's just some of my mold libraries where the rubber part happens. But this was the first series of works where I was really taking on mold making. This is called Skywalker. It's at the ICA in Philadelphia. And this is from 6 molds But so the thing that's kind of unique about my approach to mold making is I will mold a vessel, I will mold a form, but I'm not necessarily wed to casting that entire curvature. So I might just cast a section of a mold, or I might cast 6 sections of one part of a mold, or I might take one part of a mold and then elongate it with a similar kind of casting material. I look at it as almost a way that I look at the rubber that I get from molding as an odd piece of paper, and the actual casting material as a weird kind of drawing tool. So it allows me basically to not be wed to the actual first thing I started molding. So I can have 6 molds and I can make 9 heads if I just reconfigure all of their contours differently. And that's what happened with Skywalker. This is one of the heads, it's Abraham Lincoln. And this is a good example of sort of my process and the mash that happens on the form on the right. Happens all the time in the studio. I'm taking an object that I had, this underneath here is just a plaster form that then I would model clay over. My early work, a lot of reviews were comparing it to cartoons. And while there might be some cartoon references, I was feeling uncomfortable that a lot of the reviews were talking about princesses and cartoons only. And that had a lot to do with the curvature of the foam. So with foam, you can get broad curves, but the pill of the foam won't let you get like extreme detail. And so I felt like I should start challenging my own curvature. So I learned how to model clay. This is all oil-based clay. To basically pull out more resolution when I wanted to, so I could pull the overall conversation of the figurative work away from cartoon only. I could blend it in, but I wasn't reliant on it only. So there'll be parts that'll be covered with clean clay, which is what this gray stuff is, next to other weird expanding foam, next to this or that, and I love working like that in my studio. It's very, very organic, very intuitive, it can be very, I'm not bound by anything. One day I think this is great, the next day I rip it apart. But eventually things do need to be solidified, and that's in the case of Rebel Angel, which is on the left. So this is a cast of my face, and then so I cast this is one cast. This is a separate cast that I moved to the right. These are hydrostone casts. This is expandable foam. This is carved blue foam. This is steel under here. There's all different stuff in here. And instead of using paper and glue, I started to use a fiberglass mesh. It's a special mesh that's like it's not the horizontal vertical weave that you might be familiar with, like Bondo work or car auto body work. It has a circular mesh, and it allows you to really push it into convex and concave surfaces really nicely. So it creates a uniform skin, and it also covers all of these disparities. This was from an art forum ad for a show I did called Rebel Angel. There had been a review of my early work that had talked about its surfaces as impersonal to me, or as impersonal, and that was always like kind of surprising, because for much of my early work, it was built off of plaster gauze and casts of my own body, because I really had not learned or perfected or how to carve the figure and model the figure. So I just went with what I had. I didn't have any money for assistance, so I would just cast body parts, and usually that was the form in which I started building the sculptures from. So when I looked at a lot of my early work, even though it might have been really super smooth, I actually could imagine myself literally inside of it, because I had known that's how it started to be built. So I was thinking a lot about sort of myself becoming one with the sculpture. Rebel Angel's face is my face. This is a cast of me that is purposely I want to reveal that it's a cast. That's why this is not graph casted to the rest of the form. So I started thinking about actually being inside of a sculpture, and what would that mean? At the time, I was teaching all kinds of adjunct jobs, teaching jobs, And it felt like I was commuting so much and teaching so much, and really all I wanted to do is what most artists want to do, is be in their studio working. And so I was doing all of these things to kind of get back to that one core thing. And I was thinking about how a studio kind of is a surrogate being for a lot of artists. They spend a lot of time in professions to make money to feed the studio. Or when they're doing one thing, they might see something in their day, and that brings them temporarily to their studio. Or they actually just sort of might decide to sort of, a lot of times you have to kind of figure out what are you going to sieve away, whether it's time with people or money for things. Something usually has to give, and because that giving those things allows you then to put that time or that other stuff to the studio. So I was kind of looking at this studio becoming like this surrogate being and almost like this husband of sorts. And so I started thinking about what would it be like for me to create an ideal man. And I was friends with Tony Mattelli, and he had done that piece, The Ideal Woman. And I was thinking, like, I can create a soulmate out of a sculpture. Like, there's precedent for that, And the precedent was this image on the right. This is a painting of Pygmalion Galatea. Pygmalion is a Greek myth, and he's a famed sculptor, sequesters himself from sort of the rest of the town. Like, he lives like on a mountain, his studio is in there. He's like this amazing dude. He can carve anything. No woman is beautiful enough for him. So he decides he's going to carve. He's going to carve like the epitome of what is this ideal woman for him. And he carves Pygmalion. And so this painting, if you saw it, and you should pop it up, if you saw it in color, this is the moment, and he fetishizes her. He like brings this marble this marble statue, like he brings it to bed. He like puts necklaces on it. Like he's doing all this crazy stuff. He goes to some weird festival. I mean, you could fact check it, and he asks like some of the gods and goddesses, like, please, my only wish is that you can make her real. And this is the moment when he kisses her, as he does routinely, but this time she kisses him back. So the backs of her legs in the painting and her butt cheeks are like a blush pink. So I was in Richmond, and I had no money, and I was just like, I'm going to make this thing. I'm going to make this ideal man. And I had created basically kind of like an opus, which was called the Prince Project. And I started with the character of the prince. And this is just a paper template. It's like this big, and I was cutting up like things from art history books and stuff like this. I was thinking about the ideal man, and I was feeling like I could be a famed sculptor. Like I could take on like the male genius in the sort of the canon. Like, why isn't there like a female, like, a female Pygmalion? And so, I mean, I was also doing a little bit of tongue-in-cheek. I also looked at heavily the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and how Frankenstein was a pastiche of disparate parts fused together. And that was very akin to the way I was working. Everything I was seeing in my studio was some distant cousin of a Frankenstein, because I was just mashing things all the time. So I thought of like, who would become this ideal man? It wasn't supposed to be just a character for passion or for heroism. It was also to kind of make light that it's really easy to sort of stay in your studio and create an ideal mate, because the thing can't talk back to you. It's like not going to have any fights with you or anything like that. So I was also looking at kind of the pathetic quality of wanting to make a surrogate being for your own ego, which really aligned with Victor Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's novel. So my ideal man is a fusion of Abraham Lincoln, Saint Sebastian, C-3PO, and Jesus. Those figures, those characters were chosen because they all had an identifiable whole at the end of their robotic or human or fictive life. So I was ultimately choosing them for the whole. The Prince Project has 4 different quadrants. The foundation of it is a color-coded system that I had started when I got out of Yale, and it was the color-coded system that allowed me to fuse and bend those characters for chain reaction in Nordhorn, Germany. They're abductor red, creator green, guardian blue, and martyr yellow. These feed into 4 characters. They're figural sculptures that mine from the legend of the Golem. This is the precursor to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And then that goes into the chapter Wicked, which those 4 characters come together to make an amalgam called the Prince figure. Spillover is an audio and visual component to Wicked. I organize different sounds from Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, and I am going to do a dance, and then I'm going to perform the dance in the actual sculpture. I will be, even though I get older every year, I still feel like I will be more nimble with my human corporal body doing this dance than I will be when I'm in the sculpture. So I want these 2 videos opposing each other to refer to things that were designed to be together, but that will never sync up. 7 is 7 figural triads, each representing 1 dwarf from Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, 1 vice and 1 virtue. And White Light is a multi-genre installation. It includes, which you'll see in a while, 10-layer wearable made from 10 years of drawings. So this is how I started. I started with a to-scale Prince drawing. So these 4 dudes are all mashed in there. The tape is kind of a pragmatic thing, but it's also really related to the way I think and the way I make my work in my studio. Everything is a part, and every part needs to be sutured to something else. And within that act of suturing, I have the decision how I want to decide what does it mean when things merge together. Are we copacetic? Are we ruptured? Are we colliding? Are we fracturing apart? Are we mutating? These were simple models. I did a clay model, the paper model you saw. I proposed this idea. I proposed the Prince project and to start working on the Prince figure to the Guggenheim Foundation, and I was really fortunate. I got a grant to actually start building this thing, which was really exhilarating. Because a lot of people just thought I was insane. Like I was like, I want to do this, and 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 I had no money. I just had these paper dolls. So it was nice to have some money to actually build something that people could look at and start to link to the other parts of the idea. So, and it really forced me to try to amp up my clay modeling skills. So these are all the different characters, This is made, the intent for this would be that it would be molded, which it has been molded and cast in very durable materials. I'm still really interested in the power of the accessible. So this is all made from cardboard. So it's made, the form is so I could fit inside the backside of it. It's covered with insulation foam, so it's like great stuff foam. And then that's covered with a very, very hard white microcrystalline wax, and I'm embedding ribbons and other things in it to make it look like an écorché, which are muscles and tendons. The idea would be that the cast from this would get collided onto this, and I could fit inside of it. While I'm working on the large Prince project, I'm also doing other stuff too. It's not like I'm going to only work on the Prince project from now until the day I die. So some of those things relate to other sculptures for other shows, or some of them relate to sort of material questions I have, or things that I want to push. Every time I make a sculpture, I try to push something forward. I'm not interested in just cranking out the same recipe over and over again. And in my earlier work, I was being really critical on how I was using paint. The reason why I liked using the monochrome painted surface is that it obscured a lot of detail from far away. It's kind of like if you're walking, you're walking on the street and you see sort of a dark mass on the side, and you don't really give it much specificity. You just sort of look at it in relationship to other things that are happening. And then as you get closer, that dark mass breaks into many, many small little masses. And those small masses start crawling on top of each other. And that dark mass now is a pile of ants. It's only when you get close to it does that specificity reveal itself to you. So I was really interested in how the monochrome worked from far away, like kind of like a modernist form. But then as you get close, maybe you see a hand. And if you see a hand, do you then just associate some weird drapery as the abdomen, as the neck, or blah, blah, blah? So that was a cool trick with the monochrome, but I felt like I was really relying on it. So I had a no paint rule for a while, and I would only tint while material was kicking. So this is any material, any coloring that happens in the plastic or aqua resin is before it actually starts to cure. This also was the face from the Skywalker head that I redid. The 7 triads, which I had mentioned, is a fusion of one of the dwarfs from Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, a virtue and a vice, or dock, pride, humility, grumpy, wrath, patience, sleepy, sloth, diligence, dopey, greed, liberality, bashful, lust, chastity, sneezy, envy, kindness, happy, gluttony, abstinence. And I was really interested in thinking about, like, how can you make a figurative sculpture be both bashful and lustful? And if it were both, which one would the viewer link up with? Because when I look at this illusion drawing, I always see the old crone. My mom always sees the young maiden. She's like, I don't know what's wrong with you. So if I only saw the lustful part of that sculpture, is it the sculpture or is it me? So I liked how, could I move these forms to actually start to reveal a predisposition of thought within the viewer? So that's when I really started to kind of push merging these lines. And I do that a lot with drawing. The drawings are all made on a 4x8 light box. I make them just like I make my sculptures, meaning I draw a part and I tape it to a larger piece of paper, another part, another part, another part, another part, and I can move those parts until I get a semblance of whole. Then I put a whole new set of paper on that. The light comes up, I trace the lines, I cut out templates, I airbrush it through. The airbrush, in my mind, is the same as when I'm putting the skim coating over all the disparities in the sculptural work. But this happens much quicker than the sculptures. So I did a lot of these. Some for happy, gluttony, abstinence, sleepy, sloth, diligence. I went to the Mac Dowell Colony and I worked on balloons. 7 is broken into sculptures, balloons, and drawings. So I liked the idea that if I made mylar balloons of these, that they would ascend to the highest point of the room because helium in the mylar, it always gravitates to heat. So that's why when you buy a mylar balloon, like if you go outside, it's cold, it's a cold day, the balloon will shrivel up, but then you go back in your home, poofs back out, because helium expands with heat. So I thought, well, instead of making a sculpture look like it's living in one angle and then dying in another angle, what if I made these forms actually lose their form and thus their life? So then the balloons would essentially be full, and then over time they would turn into flaccid folds on the floor. And going to the Mac Dowell was really great. I had never been to a residency. When I got out of school, I felt like I could never kind of do anything like that. I needed to make money. I needed to get jobs. So I went to the Mac Dowell, got this studio. They called it the first studio, and it was awesome. They made like great food, and they gave you this basket. It was all really yummy, and I highly recommend to my students to apply to go to residencies. It pushes you out of your comfort zone, but it also gives you a new sense, like you get to meet new people and build a new community that can complement the community you're making while you're also in school. So I was working with really finicky, this balloon film, and trying to mash it with this is hydrostone, tinted hydrostone at the same time. Sometimes I'm in my studio and I get really like impulsive, and this is one of those moments where I wish I had secured this form. This was our Christmas, and there was a Dora the Explorer Christmas balloon, and I kept looking at it and looking at it, and I had made this sculpture that was a double face, and I cut up the balloon and I reconfigured it to make a new skin. And that has been increasing, cutting something up to make a new form, which you'll see in Imperceptible Rupture. But I was also really trying to be more aware of my surfacing. On the left is a piece called Mary. It's made from 9 hydrostone shells that are grafted to look like it's one continuous surface. It's about this big. On the right, it's called Visible Woman. This is essentially, Mary looks like Visible Woman pre-paint. So I wanted to see if I could work on both surfaces simultaneously. What would it mean what does it mean if something feels raw? And if it does feel raw, is it only because it has a counterpoint that's something that's been completely plasticized next to it? This is a still of my studio a few years ago. This is the Ebenstein Fortress in Koblenz, Germany. Pretty dramatic. Koblenz has a horticulture show called Buga every year, and they invite artists, landscape architects, and botanists to create different kinds of work all over the Rhine River. That year, which was 2011, it coincided with a show at the art museum called Biomorph, current artistic positions in conversation with Hans Arp. So to celebrate that show, they were going to have a Hans Arp sculpture on the Ebenstein Fortress, and they wanted to parallel it with a contemporary work. So Heike Strelo, who's the curator, asked me if I wanted to make something. And so I had started my first 7, which was Dog, Pride, Humility, and I thought it would be really cool to come back to Germany and install a new work, but have it be entirely different. So we decided to make Dog, Pride, Humility for the Ebenstein Fortress. And so that idea of disparities and mashing different parts that happens in the drawings and is really coming to fore now. These are cast in microcrystalline wax. I wanted Doc Pride to have a lot more sculptural textural information. The earlier works were very smooth. They kind of felt like those weird, those fake rocks that you could get to kind of cover a key, by your door. That's what it felt like. It felt like it was like a blob that if you lifted it up, it would be hollow. And I was like, I think it should do more than that. So I cast, these were milled. Since it was on a fortress, I made multiple foam, CNC, whatever, renderings of the chainmail pattern in different sizes. We milled them flat, so I can mold them flat, so I didn't have to deal with all the intricacies of molding such a complex form. And then if you back it with cheesecloth, put it in hot water, you can bend it and upholster, which is what I did there. I also upholstered different patterns in these welded forms. And then all of those, after all those disparities get molded, this is the first layer of silicone, cracking it out. After the casts are done, these are 2 different sculptures. This is Doc Pride, Humility on your left, and this is Death of the Virgin, which went to the art museum at the same time on the right. So it gives you a sense of how they're actually built. Doc is getting painted. Doc is getting installed. Doc is near Hans Arp. This is his 1960 work, Dance, Finery, in Motion, and this is photographed through Dance, Finery, in Motion on the Ebenstein Fortress. So while this was happening, I was also asked to put a work in the art museum, and this is the original iteration of Death of the Virgin. I was really interested in how when women are pregnant, their intestines scooch up to make room for the baby. And I'm always sort of flipping references up on top of themselves. And I also twist the anatomy a lot. So I was looking at Death of the Virgin, which is a famous painting, and but it's a painting of a woman, and I wanted to sort of twist that again and make my Death of the Virgin a male figure, but make his intestines as if they had scooched up like a female's intestines. The first iteration had a whole elaborate steel armature that I made at RISD and all these cast items. But it was returned to me all broken from a gallery and kind of in real big disarray. So I had to do some really I had to revise the whole thing for this show. So this is the second iteration where I repaired lots of stuff, and that was at the art museum. And this was also in Eric Fischl had a show called Disturbing Innocence last year. And this is Jake and Dino's Chapman piece at Inca Essenheim. So it was in that show, which was great fun. But none of this is cast like Doc Pride. This is all really vulnerable in terms of archival quality. This is foam, you could kick it and it would break. So I'm really trying to embrace more both impermanence and permanence, although there's a lot of pushback for that. And in this one, I was really trying it hard. This is Prince 2. This is Abraham Lincoln. And this bottom piece is cardboard covered with wax. When you use high expandable foam, you have about 30 seconds until it solidifies. So I spend a lot of time creating cardboard dams and bridges and weird plastic balloons to train to move the foam, because I don't want it to just do what it does, because that is how industry built it. I just want to access its material properties, but I want to move it where I want to move it. So it's very different moving that kind of foam than the polystyrene foam. So that's high density foam. It's very carefully architected into certain sections. This is plaster, so I've got to build dams. So when I'm pouring the plaster, it locks into that place. Underneath here is balloon skin, some of the skins I had used at Mac Dowell. It all comes together in a larger form. This was at Mixed Greens Gallery. And it's basically, I'm just eviscerating at this point the figures. After this time, I wanted to get back into the Prince project, but I wanted to start from the backside. And since I'm cutting up a lot, I'm always cutting things in the studio, breaking them down. I'm really interested in how I have no nostalgia for things I've made before. If it's taking up space, and I have a pretty large studio, if it takes up space, I'm throwing it out. So I'm usually throwing everything away. With my drawings, I don't do that so much, mostly because they're flat. So I was looking at my drawings, and I thought it would be interesting if white light was summoned from me, but referenced nothing of my figural proportion. I was looking at samurai warrior armor, and I had decided that I was going to make the engine for a white light from a wearable that was built from the last 10 years of my drawings. So the first thing I did was I took out all my drawings, except for a few that I felt were still good, and I cut them, and then I sewed them into small strips. I was looking at, as I mentioned, samurai warrior armor. I was really interested in this because for a short time it did have protective, it was used as protective gear, and I liked how there was this textile element along with the metal element, but also its pomp and circumstance there's pomp and circumstance with all kinds of armor, but this, there's so many ridiculous elements. Like some of the headdresses are like huge, like butterfly wings, and like these really furry, like caterpillar eyebrows, and just really fun stuff that I was interested in as a sculptor. I'm also really interested in the construction properties of high-end fashion. This is Alexander McQueen dress. This is my cat. Her name's Louise Bourgeois. Matt and I found her on Matt's dad's farm. She was abandoned by her mama. So we took her and drove her 20 hours back from Minnesota to Pennsylvania. And she's a helper in the studio, and you can see she's doing some quality control. I refer to these as nuggets. So these are all my drawings that were in the strips that are now been cut small. Because if you look at samurai warrior armor, it's all stitched with like maybe 1 inch threading of a cording. So these were kind of supposed to be the cording. And I did not know how to sew very well, but one of my undergraduate students had gone to Rhode Island School of Design with the hopes to go to FIT. Then she decided she wanted to go for sculpture, so she knew how to sew. And she wanted to do a 7-credit independent study with me and learn how to mold. And I said, no, I will learn from you. Teach me how to sew. So together we made a 10-layer wearable that functions as both a sculpture. Here it is. This is one of our galleries at Penn State. This was a faculty show. It functions as a sculpture and a wearable. When it functions as a wearable, it allows me to make a new animated drawing from the last decade of my drawings. That gets videotaped, and that footage spills over sculptures. And when that happens, Armor for White Light has now created white light. These are just different details as the object on me. These 3 images are in a show in Chicago now about wearable art. from left to right, to tie, to stand, to perform. The fun thing about the armor is that you can light it in all different kinds of weird ways. These are some of the sculptures that I'm making for white. So the video projection, this is obviously in clay on the left, gets cast in plastic. A lot of the sculptures will have holes in them, like odd wiffle balls, so when the projection goes on them, it fills out the interior contours. And I'm also making interior fabric linings for them. At the time, I was also got another grant for another project called Imperceptible Rupture. And I had now it's 10 years later, right? I've got all these molds. Like, what are you gonna do with all this stuff? And I was like, I had given myself an assignment to make collages, which I was really insecure about because it seemed so foundational. But I felt like collaging with other types of images would push the way I was using scale and texture, and it would prevent me from going to my regular go-tos with my fingers. So I looked at these collages and I thought about fetish figures in African art and the importance of repetitive strikes of the hand, building them and nailing things to them. And I started to look at my molds more as pieces of paper that I could pull things from. And I found this really cool clay. It's called monster clay. Because when I take the wax and I put the cheesecloth in it and turn it, it's resistant. You have to make a pretty thick wall thickness of wax to do it. It doesn't want to bend like this. It wants to bend like that. So it's preventative. But I can do the same thing. I can melt this wax. I can brush it into a mold. I can then back it with cheesecloth, but then I can really move this like taffy. So I was looking at this clay very similar to the way that I had sewn armor for white light. I was going to patchwork it, or I was going to collage it. And while I did that, I was also going to collage other found things into it as well. These are the molds from Imperceptible Rupture. And these are some of the heads. So this is Aqua Resin submerged with graphite and bronze powder. They look better when it's dark, this guy's like this big. And there's 1,000, I wanted to cue that fetish figure reference, and there's 1,000 hand-sewn strips from different clothing that get nailed to the base of this. This one's called Homecoming. It's called Dutch Girl. This one is called Secret Society. This one's called Warrior Mask. And this one is Folded Mouse. Last year I was asked to participate in the American Academy of Arts and Letters Invitational Show. And we put both Armor for White Light and A More Perfect Union into that show. This is my studio. A lot of stuff going on. The green screen room allows me to kind of work on some animations. This is what happens in my studio all the time. I'm just shoving shit together. But I'm trying to really make it much more liquid now. So mashing the baskets into the clay takes a little bit of time and finesse. That's what I'm doing for this guy. That guy is up here in this iteration. And I'm kind of, if something's laying around my studio, if I've photographed it and it hasn't sold, which hardly any of my stuff sells, which is another reason why I'm at Central Pennsylvania. That studio is very economical. Gives me a lot more money to put on my work versus covering my overhead. I just keep working on it. I think it's incredibly frustrating for dealers. Whatever. This is 6 screenshots spliced together from 2 minutes of the last section of a kabuki performance called Sagi Musame, and that's translated as the Heron Maiden in Tokyo. This is the last part of the dance, and the actor morphs from a maiden into a heron spirit by a quick change of costumes. You can see the actor is initially wearing pink. The actor goes behind this umbrella, and other assistants basically pull the pink part of the costume down to reveal red. This is supposed to symbolize the bitterness of the character's heart from a betrayal from her love. Then that actor goes behind the umbrella again, and the red part of the garment folds down to then reveal the white garment, and that is supposed to symbolize her transformation into the Heron. So this is like basically 2 minutes, and this is happening. And I'm really into this idea. I'm like, oh wow, like this idea, you can engineer something for it to actually change, like actually transform and move. So I started, I really want to figure out why I'm so interested in sewing. And can I graft the sewn parts like I've done with the foam, like I've done with the clay? I don't know if this, so I can't, this basically is one simple turn that reveals this is a cast. So I want to eventually turn this hard cast and cut through the fabric so that the hard cast busts through the fabric and also have holes in the hard cast where the fabric pulls through. I'm trying to be much more attentive to mashing fabric. These are different sculptures that are happening in the studio now. These nets are all made from balloon skins. So it's like the balloons, the helium balloons, I collect them, and then I've learned how to make large nets with them. So this is going to be kind of in a large detritus of garbage. The garbage, though, I think it'll look pretty, it's going to look aesthetically nice, but it's just going to be those balloon skins. My goal with this one is to mash baskets the way I've done. This is the finished one before rubber goes on it, and then it will get cast, is to mash the baskets all throughout this entire sculpture. And this is my studio today. It's a little crowded. And that's my little cat again. So, thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Sure, I have questions. Yes. This is just for recording, though. It might be two parts, I don't know. A question about how you arrived at and describe your signs that you're using, your semiotic code, especially around things like Mickey Mouse and things like the holes in your Perfect Man. Nobody else laughed at the holes in the Perfect Man. I thought that was hilarious. So could you talk more about how you arrived at Mickey Mouse, what Mickey Mouse means in terms of signifier signified, and how you arrived at the holes and what the holes mean in terms of signifier signified?
It's a great question. So, and there's always, I find out there's always these gaps in, when I'm giving a lecture, things I'm not explaining well. So one of the reasons why I started the lecture with Mike Kelley is to emphasize how I grew to admire his dedication to research and how research creates a structure, and then the form gets riffs off the structure. I had been cueing Mickey Mouse and Disney for a long time, ever since really my thesis show. I really wasn't read fairy tales as a young person, so when I came to it, I was coming to it as a young woman, and thinking about how puritanical the packaging of Snow White had become since the original iteration from its Germanic legend. And so that sort of whitewashing that's ever present in Disney, I was living in Echo Park and just looking at sort of Pocahontas backpacks and skews of characters, skews of race, skews of facts or origins are ever present, I feel like, in Disney characters. And in that way, and at the same time, I also was really, I was both being very critical of Disney and then using it as a metaphor for America, but I was also being kind of reverent of an aspect that Snow White was the first realistically rendered female in the Disney studios. So the effort was to try to not make her look cartoony. So what they did was, in order to get her line quality, what's that?
Rotoscope.
I don't know.
The rotoscope Snow White. That's why she looks so smooth and weird.
Maybe.
No.
They took the line drawing from a silly symphony called The Goddess of Spring, which was Persephone and Pluto. And this was not a successful silly symphony. So it just was making dust. They took that line drawing and they merged it with a line drawing of Betty Boop. And together, those things had created the initial line drawings for Snow White. So I was really interested in how this Greek myth had high jumped a dramatic legend to start to create an American icon. And Snow White was a successful feature film, and it gave fiscal growth for the Disney studios. So I really liked that she, in some ways, as a character, ushered in this empowerment. So almost in every sculpture I have, whether it's actually noticeable or not, I have the maniacal Mickey Mouse smile to cue, I guess, both edges, both kind of a cynicism as well as a pioneering spirit of what I was associating with America at that time. So that's one of the symbols in the larger. Also, the whole is because I'm a woman, and because I am making the ideal man. And while it might seem kind of pathetic to make an ideal man, I actually know how to do it. Because I've spent years learning how to mold. I've spent years learning how to cast. And so if there's going to be one continual thing that strings all these disparities, then it's going to be the whole.
Lincoln, Jesus, C-3PO, and what's the fourth one?
Abraham Lincoln, Jesus, C-3PO, and Saint Sebastian.
Okay. Just dead guys and robots?
Fictional characters, or potentially
Lincoln.
factual characters.
You could argue Lincoln's a fictional character.
I could, like,
Who's the real Lincoln?
the
They write books and books and
idolatry
books
of
about
Lincoln, yeah, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're all characters that I have come to understand through simulation. I don't know Jesus, and I don't know Lincoln, and I don't know C-3PO, and I don't know Saint Sebastian. But a simulated image through film or a print has brought them to me. So some might think some of those characters are real, and some might think some of those characters are fiction. Yes?
Your practice is definitely extremely dependent on the fluidity you have with materials. And I guess I'm just wondering about how you got started with that. I know in the beginning you mentioned that it was when you saw Mike Kelley's work that you kind of felt like freed from the bind of using marble or steel or something like that, that you could just use anything. But was there anything before that? I mean, you were using plastic and film before that. I guess what I'm asking is, were you trained in that, or what was it that made you start using those materials in the beginning?
My undergraduate schooling was incredibly responsible for teaching all kinds of different ways to build. And there was just an inherent curiosity to want to learn how to do something without necessarily being wed to an outcome, which I think is a good way to kind of go along an assignment when you have an assignment parameter like that. But one of the true pleasures of teaching, and I think this happens more at the undergraduate level, but it can happen at the graduate level, is watching a student who is really getting invested in, they don't know what they're doing, but they're really invested in the iterative stages of building something to find out what can happen. And a lot of times when an artist gets older, they can get codified, especially if their work gets recognized and it gets put in print and it gets sold. There's a pressure to have to mainstream what you do. And in a way, I really like to have the work always touch back to that moment of discovery of like, how does this work? What is it doing? What is it doing? And so when I'm in my studio, I think also like now I feel like I've got a really good handle on how to make hard twisting forms. Doesn't mean that I'm going to knock it out of the park every time, but I've worked hard to figure out the troubleshooting steps in that. Now I want to figure out like what more can I do, and is it only with those same materials? And so I just always like to look at, it's like a game I do when I'm walking. I look at things, and if I see a coffee cup, I try, and I ask my students to do this too. I said, don't define it as what it is. Define it as what it does. What does it do? So what is it? You can slice it. You can pulverize it. You could shred it. Like how many verbs? Like a Richard Serra like kind of exercise. Like what could you do to it? And then not that that's going to make your idea interesting, but it could be a way that action placed onto prescribed product can generate more meaning than not. So I just like to see what I get. And a lot of times, that's why I love working in a studio, because I feel like I am able to really investigate an evolving thesis that doesn't have, that I still don't really have an understanding of. But I know the way that I work with materials is all about eviscerating and recombining. I guess to answer your question is I just like to see what I can get.
It was kind of like already asked before, but why is it important to you to like have all these like symbols that can be seen through your work and carry them through each piece?
It's a great question. I don't think that the symbols are seen through the work. Like a lot of people have asked me like, why don't you write out the narrative for the Prince project? Like actually like, write out what it all means. And the reason why I don't want to do that is because I want the sculptures to be embodied by the viewer. Either they will be into them or not. I don't want them to be read linearly like a text inevitably would be. For me, I am so interested in building and making, and like I just like shoving it together, that I feel like that interest could happen with anything. But for me, I feel like I need to have a formed concept to basically, if I'm mashing something around, I think about it in relationship to these signifiers, so that it helps me sculpt, essentially. It helps me make more intelligent decisions as I'm breaking material down, because I have a reference in mind. But I'm also not expecting the viewer to know this whole system. This is basically, my dream is like before I'm dead, like all of these 4 quadrants would be seen, like, and a viewer can walk through all of them, but they're not staged as 1, 2, 3, 4. And theoretically, maybe then they come up with an entirely different narrative. But that's essentially the way I feel like history has been given to me. Like, information has been consciously and unconsciously edited out. The victor always wins. The victor wins. That's what we know of history, right? So I'm making my own story from the things that I read. Sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it, and we just start changing things. So I feel like the story, my narrative, has been built on the fictions of others. So for it to properly honor that research, it needs to allow itself to germinate in newer forms by the viewer. And that's why I don't explain all the symbols. I mean, I do here because I'm here, and what else am I going to say, right?
We have another question.
So it seems that dichotomy is important in your work, especially with like the dwarves you were working with. You also mentioned at one point you got criticism about things looking princesses and cartoony.
Mhm.
And then it seemed after that you went to the Prince project.
Mhm.
So how does the binary of princess and prince, or binaries, play in with your criticism and decisions on what to do next?
I'm not sure. I don't really consciously think about what am I going to do next. I think about how am I going to do what I want to do, knowing that what I want to do hasn't really been formed yet. So usually if I start building a character or a figure, it might have ties to the Prince project and it might not. If it does have ties to the Prince project, I try to use 360 degrees as a ruler for change, so that if it looks one way in one angle, then if the viewer's body turns around it, or maybe in this newer work when a video camera captures it actually turning, the things that were presumed about it at one angle dissolve it's basically like you're breaking down expectations, so that the ultimate kind of translation of it isn't fixed. So sometimes that's about working off a binary, but more times it's working off the associations of binaries and what would lead someone to think a form is masculine, or is a prince, or is deflated, or is elated. And I'm trying to use less references to things, but to nuances, and then twisting them as the form, as I move around while I'm sculpting it. And I think I get such an awkward stew. Slumgillion is the vocabulary word of the day. It is a beef watery stew, just so you know. You can impress your friends when you go drinking tonight. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like that. Right. Thank you very much.